and evening, product people. Thank you so much for joining us today for our second Sochology session. Our last session featured Fahad Hafiz, Senior Product Manager at Datto, who talked about how product managers get the best out of their engineering teams. Before we begin the session, I just want to mention a few housekeeping rules. Please keep your mic off during the session. Please wait till the end to ask questions as we've dedicated a slot for that. So today's session topic is outcome-driven product management, and our speaker today is Ali Raahim, who is currently head of product at CarSwitch, a peer-to-peer used marketplace which aims to bring unparalleled ease and transparency to the car buying and selling process in the GCC. Ali, I gotta tell you, I'm really into cars and I've bought many used cars over the years, so love what you're doing at CarSwitch. Ali is a product enthusiast with more than 7 years of experience delivering high-impact products for a diverse set of tech companies in the automotive, healthcare, marketing automation, and grocery delivery verticals across the GCC, Pakistan, and the US. Ali, we're honored and thrilled for you to join us and really look forward to your insights. Please take it away.
Thank you so much, Melissa. Thank you for that introduction. And honestly, super excited to be here. I was going through the list of attendees on LinkedIn, I think yesterday, and honestly saw so many people that I would actually love to hear from. So it was quite an honor to see everyone attending, and what you guys have put together through this product search group is, I think, is really commendable. We do need a community. We do need a group to learn from each other and grow as a community, as a country even. So I think if this is being done through any means, I think that's super. So thank you so much for having me once again, and I won't drag this out too long. Let's just get started with the session, right? Um, so outcome-driven product management. Before we delve into things, a little bit about me, just so we get that out of the way. Um, and can one of you just confirm that you see the screens changing, because I don't see them change at my end. Um, I'm hoping and assuming that's a yes. All right, so a little bit about me, just so we get that out of the way. I've been in the product management space for roughly 8 years now, the last three and a half of which have been spent or being involved with managing other PMs, and of course, before that, as an individual contributor. I'm currently leading product at CarSwitch, which is operating in the UAE and Saudi Arabia. The idea behind the business is that we sort of like the Upwork for used car sales, whereby we connect private buyers who are looking to buy cars with private sellers who are looking to sell them, and we earn a commission when the deal closes through our platform. Before CarSwitch, I was with two startups, or helped build products for two startups, namely OlaDoc in Pakistan, which is a leading health tech platform, and before that with Referizer, which is a B2B marketing automation SaaS play based out of Florida in the United States. So that's just a little bit about me. And about the session itself, I have a couple of disclaimers before we start. Almost none of the content that you'll see or hear me talk about is or could be considered strictly original. What I mean by that is I won't be telling you anything that you can't find on Google if you knew where to look. There's obviously a lot of people much smarter than me, much wiser than me, who've spoken about these things and who've penned down their thoughts on Twitter, books, blog posts. So feel free to go over those, complement your knowledge whichever way you can. But obviously, I won't also waste your time here. So I'll try to share some of my real life tactics and examples that I've seen work, and put, of course, my own spin on the stuff that I share, so that it's hopefully useful for the audience here today. Um, and the second point that I want to mention is that there is no one size fits all in product, as far as I know. So take everything that I share with you today and look at it through the lens of your own product, its customers, its pain points, and your own journey as a product manager, and also within your organization. So I feel that's really important to keep in mind as you go through some of the things that I will share. All right, moving on. Actually, I think we skipped a slide. Right. So, what are we here to talk about today? Of course, we'll be talking about roadmaps, how you should approach them, what are the good and the bad ways of doing that, and what are the pros and cons of these approaches. Once you figured out how to approach roadmaps, what is it that you put in them? How do you think about, your planning exercises? And then how do you end up executing on those roadmaps, making sure that you're making progress in a meaningful way? And then finally, we'll wrap it up with some examples of how everything could be practiced in a real world scenario, and then some tactics to make sure that you're staying true to the path and headed in the right direction as far as this outcome driven product management approach is concerned. Obviously, the topics that I've mentioned here are quite broad, so I can't say I would do justice to them in this short session or conversation. So, obviously, I try to keep it high level, but I don't mean to belittle any of the complexity that comes with, each one of these topics. So, let's keep that in mind, and try to go from there. All right. So, like I said, everything that I shared today will and can be found on Google. So let's use Google to figure out what product roadmaps are. And Google pulls up a nice little snippet for us, telling us that a product roadmap is a shared source of truth that outlines the vision, direction, priorities, and progress of a product over time. Um, it's pretty simple, right? Let's just boil that down even further and say a product roadmap is essentially just a set of priorities. Yeah, and I would like us to focus on the word priorities because it has multiple different connotations, some of which are useful and some which are not so useful. And the purpose and the agenda for the next few slides, at least, is going to be focusing on these priorities and what they mean and how we can go about setting them and thinking about them. So, um, all right, I skip through. All right, so the transitions don't work apparently on this slide deck, but that's okay. So the idea that you should wait, there's something up with the slide. Anyways, okay. So the idea is you could be when you start thinking about priorities, right? And this is usually done at some frequency. Could be 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, whatever suits your product organization. So you sit down and you need to discuss priorities, right? You could be on one end of the spectrum, which is on the extreme left, where you're sitting down and all that gets talked about is features that you'll build, enhancements that you'll make, bugs that you'll fix, basically stuff that you'll ship. And you're super specific, you're super detailed, and it gets everyone excited around what you're doing. It gets the sales team super excited, customer support, your executives, and everyone's like, "Whoa, yeah, we're gonna ship all of this wonderful stuff," and that's beautiful. So that's one sort of super detailed. The other end, which is on the extreme right, is where executives or management dictates some high level goals for the product roadmap, and that's the level they want you to operate at. So they could say, next 6 months we want to increase the revenue by 50% or 30%, whatever, or reduce cost or improve our unit economics. Now those are all, I'm not saying those are not desirable outcomes or goals, but they're essentially too vague for a product team or a product manager to go back and make sense of. So it has to be, you need to dig that down further, unpack it a little bit, and make sure that you're operating at the right level of granularity when these conversations take place. So I would argue, and a lot of people smarter than me have argued in product circles, that the level of detail that you should be operating at lies somewhere in the middle, and that middle is called outcomes. So instead of working on outputs, which is on the extreme left, or working with high level KPIs or concepts like revenue and cost, you should indeed be working on setting priorities for outcomes that you want. Now, what are outcomes? The textbook definition of a product outcome is a change in human behavior that drives business results. And I use the word human loosely here. A human could be a customer that you're serving, whether they're paying or not paying. It could be one of your internal stakeholders. It could be your staff. So anyone and everyone who has a stake in the product or have something to do with what your product or your business does is considered human. And in setting priorities for those humans, you're essentially asking yourself, what are the human behaviors that I can influence through something that I do on the product that will drive positive business results for me? So, for example, you could say, I want my users to do more of X, to do less of Y, or to spend less time accomplishing or doing this, right? And by enacting all of these behavioral changes, you're fairly confident that you will be able to drive certain business results that are important. So, for example, a classified site which runs on an advertising model could say, we would benefit, our product manager over there could say, we would benefit from users viewing more pages on the platform. So that becomes the outcome that they want to influence, right? The human behavior is to that they view some pages. So how do I make sure that they view more? So that's the change in the human behavior. Similarly, it could be, you want them to scroll down more so that they can see more ads, maybe get more impressions, or you want them to bounce less. So when they come to the website, you want them to engage on certain things instead of bouncing. So those are all um, examples of outcomes and human behavior, essentially, that you could try to influence through an exercise like this. So the idea behind this whole slide is, when you get into these conversations with your team, internal stakeholders, executives, and all the relevant people, the conversation should not start at the output level, which is, we will build XYZ. It could start at a high level, which is, we're concerned about revenue or cost, but it quickly has to boil down to, what are the outcomes that we want to achieve in the next period that we're planning for. All right. Um, And as a result of this exercise, what you would want to get is an outcome driven roadmap. So instead of having an output driven roadmap where you have, uh, you know, feature X, feature Y, enhancement A, bug fix, whatever, prioritized in a list of, in a Google Sheet or Jira or whatever tool you choose to work with, you instead have a list of outcomes that you want to deliver. So again, changes in human behavior that would drive business results, which is, you could be, get someone to view more pages, get someone to interact with this, get someone to, pay more for this. So those are all those behaviors that you could come up with. Um, and then, for like, you could say, for example, if there's a marketplace, right, and like we discussed, you could have different user types. So that's where the human aspect comes in. You could say, a buyer, you want them to view more products, or a seller, you want them to, when they're putting up an ad, you want them to put more pictures for their ads. So those are all examples of human behaviors that you could try to influence. And essentially, what you're now getting is a list of outcomes that you're going to pursue over the next period. So why are we doing this? I think that's the important question, right? Why are we harping so much about being outcome driven as opposed to output driven? So there's some key benefits of doing this, and also some negatives, by the way. So it's important to recognize those as well. So in terms of benefits, the I think the biggest one that you get is, actually, the biggest one is probably the third one. But in terms of the team itself, I think your team is more likely to feel empowered when they're not being told what to build, but instead being told problems that they need to solve. And those problems are intrinsically linked to business success. So, it's an empowering feeling to be able to affect something like a key business metric by doing something on the product. So I think in terms of just team autonomy, engagement point of view, think it's a better way of working. The second one that I feel is also very important is, the way outcome driven roadmaps are built is that you automatically deprioritize work that does not move the needle. So you're essentially building in a reward mechanism, of saying, I'm not going to reward busy work or stuff that's not moving the needle or that's not meaningful enough for the business. Instead, I'm going to reward outcomes which drive business results. So it tends to bring a lot of focus into the team. And more often than not, you tend to achieve more with less resources because now everyone is super focused on these, you know, honed in critical business outcomes that you want to achieve. The third one actually feels like a bit of, it feels like you're cheating because the way we defined business, outcomes was uh, changes in human behavior that drive business results. So of course, when you succeed on your roadmap, it is going to mean that you succeeded on your business. So the third one is a yeah, it's a bit like you it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy, but that's also the beauty of an outcome-driven roadmap in the sense that whatever you do is intrinsically and deeply connected or linked to the success of the business. So if you deliver, you are successful. If you don't deliver, at least the as far as the product is concerned, it did not contribute positively to business success. Now obviously the challenge in all of this is figuring out what are the outcomes that you should be working on, right? And how do you then deliver on those outcomes in a meaningful way? And that's something that we'll cover shortly in the remaining session. Now, to talk about negatives, there's a bunch, but the couple that I do want to focus on is the first one is an outcome-driven roadmap has a lot of ambiguity. So if you're working with someone who doesn't understand what this means or the value that it brings, it absolutely shrouds everything in uncertainty and makes it a lot harder to bring alignment across the board, right? So if you have, for example, executives or internal staff members who do not appreciate what you're trying to do with being outcome driven, then it's very hard to and it creates a lot of discomfort because they're unaware what you're actually planning to work on in terms of feature launches, your bug fixes, new product launches. So just to operate at that level of ambiguity where you don't actually know what you're going to do, but you know what problem you're trying to solve or what human behavior you're trying to change, is something that product professionals might get comfortable with, but it generally takes or is much harder for people outside the product circle to learn to appreciate. So that tends to become a big friction point when something like this is being adopted in the organization, and especially where the business or the product is sales driven. So where you have salespeople or customer support who expect to know when certain things will launch or what you're planning on doing in the next 3 6 months so that they can keep customers informed and updated, right? And that's where all of these sort of discussions, hard discussions, come in, and you need to create clarity out of uncertainty, and that's essentially the job that you perform in that sense. In these conversations, what I found useful when you have people pushing on, delivering key features and asking when this is going to get done, it's I found it useful to bring the conversation back to the level of what is the problem that you're trying to solve for the customer. So maybe we can't give you a definitive timeline for when feature X will launch, but if we can agree on the problem that we're trying to solve, then I can tell you how I'm trying to solve it, right? So I can give you more ideas. I might have other things in my on my plate that I'm trying to do to address the same problem. And if they can learn to appreciate that I think that simplifies a bunch of things and a bunch of conversations where you can sort of create alignment at that level instead of having to commit certain deadlines for features which may or may not get developed depending on how your roadmap performs and how which outcomes you end up delivering. The second big pitfall of this approach, obviously, is that progress is less visible. So, in an output driven roadmap, it's very easy to say that I shipped these 10 things and you check them off the roadmap and you say, fine, this is all done. In an outcome driven roadmap, since you don't work with a list of features, you work with a list of outcomes that you want to deliver. And maybe you do 10 things trying to drive that outcome, but none of them work. So, do you say that your roadmap, you didn't do anything? And that's sort of the feeling that people in the organization might get, like if they ask you, okay, what have you delivered on the roadmap, and if your roadmap is a set of outcomes, then it's hard to say that you delivered anything when that outcome wasn't actually achieved, right? So it's sort of making your own life difficult because then it's hard for you to justify what you've been doing, but at the same time everyone's on the same team, and it's about creating that alignment and creating that shared understanding that this is the right approach and this is how we're going to approach product building product, and we will see the fruit of this approach. All right. Some important caveats here. The first one being that output-driven plans are not necessarily bad. I know I've been uh, speaking a lot about being outcome-driven and prioritizing outcomes and forgetting about output, but the harsh reality, or actually the reality, is any outcome at the end of the day gets translated into a list or set of outputs, right? If you want to deliver a change in human behavior, you can't do that without executing on some output, some feature, some enhancement, some bug fix, right? So everything at the end of the day is going to get translated into an output plan. And whether that output plan is done at a sprint level or a monthly level, at some granularity, you would have to say for the next 1 month, this is the stuff that I'm working on, and these are concrete tickets of features, and this is the list, and this is what it looks like, right? So just to say, output-driven plans are bad I think is a bit of a reach. Just need to keep that in mind. I know project management has earned a bad rep in certain circles in product, where people, it's almost become a tabooed word when you talk about project management. It's like, no, this product is not project management. But I genuinely believe project management or driving output is an integral part of product management, right? Because you can't deliver on outcomes if you don't do delivery well. So making sure that that part is happening is an essential part of any PM's job. So need to recognize that. Um, and the second thing that I think is also important to recognize is, if your roadmap is purely output driven, don't consider that everything is lost. And I know a lot of product organizations that I've looked at, worked with, do fall in that category, where at some point they do make that transition. But historically, what they've worked with is a list of output or features that they sit together and decide they work on, and that's how the execution or the roadmap works. If you're starting off in such a setting, I encourage you to reverse engineer your outcomes from your list of outputs and build flexibility into your plans depending on whether those outcomes are achieved or not. And I think over the next slide, I'll show you how that could be done. But before we do that, let's talk about no, actually, let's jump into that, right? So, how do you convert the an output driven roadmap, which you see in the table at the top? How do you convert that into an outcome driven roadmap? So the idea is, you have a list of tasks that you think you want to do. So that's an output driven roadmap. You decided certain features that you want to work on, and you also have this order of execution that you want to do it in. Now, how do you go from that to an outcome driven roadmap? And I've shared one strategy, right? So you could literally just create two more data points or two more columns along with this, and say, for each of these features, I'm going to reverse engineer what the outcome is. And this is obviously assuming that the people who came up with these features knew something about the product, so there was some rationale or some idea behind why they want to do these things. So you figure that out, you figure out the outcome that you're trying to drive, and you add another column saying, is this outcome important for the business right now? And what you could see with that is, maybe there is an outcome that you would be working on as part of feature D, which is actually not that important for the business at the moment, but because maybe the funnel looks okay, so there isn't really a pressing need to work on feature D because the conversion funnel isn't the most pressing matter at the moment. And then on the first two on this list, for example, you could say, okay, they belong to the same outcome. So I'm going to try doing feature A, which is the first thing. I'll try it, and if it doesn't work, then I'll do the enhancement B. Otherwise, I won't. So you change the order to it and just say it depends. So I'm not committing to doing it. I'm just going to try feature A first, see if the outcome is achieved, and if it is, then I will not do it. If it's not, then I might do it. And that's how you sort of migrate or transition from an purely output driven roadmap and one. And then hopefully from this point onwards, you start having those discussions at the outcome level, and the roadmap gets defined thinking about outcomes first and not output. I guess the $1 million question is, how do you know which outcomes to pursue? So it's all fine saying, you focus on outcomes. If outcomes get delivered, business metrics will improve, your business will be successful. So that's all fine. But how do you figure out which outcomes to pursue? There's a couple of strategies that we could use. The first one is called customer journey maps, which we'll go over right now. So the idea with customer journey maps is that you step into the customer's shoes and literally list down all the steps the customer performs as they interact with your product or your business, and you create these simplistic journeys. So they in a real world scenario, these journeys are never linear. So you would have users jumping between different steps and going back and forth and skipping some steps or performing some steps multiple times. But the idea is to just do a simplistic linear version of what is it that the journey looks like for a particular user. So, for example, in CarSwitch case, we have buyers, sellers, and we have our own staff that deals with these two types of customers. So for a buyer, it could say, they discover the car through organic or inorganic means, browse, compare, ask questions, negotiate, go view the car or test drive it, and then they agree a deal and eventually pay the seller. And on the seller side, they put up the ad, they look at offers that come in, they accept, reject, counter, they entertain test drives, and then they finally agree on a selling price and get paid. So those are two journeys that we've done at CarSwitch, just quickly depicting the steps that a segment of users perform. Um, Obviously, some of those steps aren't captured here and are more complicated than this. So, and that's something that once you start doing this and make it a habit of doing it, you start appreciating those details. So, for example, one of the steps that happens in a buyer journey is someone views an inspection report for a car. Now, looking at historic data, you could say that if a buyer has viewed the car's inspection report before they submit a request to test drive the car, they're more likely to buy the car, right? So again, that becomes a behavior that's part of the customer journey. And by looking at data, you've somehow figured out that that's an important hook or an important determinant of whether the guy eventually buys the car or not. So you could try to influence that behavior, right? You could try to say, how do I make sure that almost everyone or most people view the inspection report before they submit a test drive request? So it's stuff like that the customer journey map helps with, especially when you combine it with historical data and how things have evolved in the past. So the second one is a revenue equation, and for me, that's probably my go-to mechanism or strategy for figuring out which stuff to work on. Um, and that's because I lean heavily on numbers when I'm making decisions. So I like to think of everything that we do in terms of numbers and what impact it creates in terms of numbers, right? So the idea here is to break things down as much as you can, starting from some top level metrics such as revenue. So you have a high level concept or KPI called revenue, which is your impact, and then you break that down into further bits until you arrive at a sufficient level of granularity that you can reasonably say that I can influence through the product, right? So you start with revenue. For in our case, in CarSwitch's case, you could break it down into transaction, advertising, and dealer listing revenue, meaning so these are three revenue streams that we have, right? So when the car sells through our platform is what we call transaction revenue. We run ads, we earn advertising revenue on that, and then we work with dealers to list their cars on our platform, and we get paid for those listings. So that's another revenue stream. If you were to unpack the first one, we could say, what is transaction revenue? It is the number of sell requests we get. So number of sellers who come to us saying they want to sell their car, multiplied by the publishing ratio, meaning if we get 100 sellers, but our publishing ratio is only 40%, meaning we only publish 40% of the cars and the 60% fall off for some reason, and then multiply that by the selling ratio. So of the cars we put up, what percentage do we sell? Now, if you multiply these three numbers, you'd get your transaction revenue. Now you could break that down even further and say, what is my selling ratio? My selling ratio is actually number of views that I get on cars multiplied by the leads generated per view. And by leads, I mean buyers requesting to view the car multiplied by the conversion ratio of those leads. And again, if you multiply these three numbers, this results in a sale, right? So that's your selling ratio. This might not be mathematically 100% correct, but the idea is to have to keep zooming in or keep unpacking metrics until you reach a level where you can reasonably say that I can do something on the product to affect one of these metrics. So, for example, you could say, how do I make sure that people submit more leads per view? Could I do something on the product page that encourages them to perform more of this action? Could I present the information in some different way? Could I work with the call to action buttons to make them more engaging and stuff like that? You could do a similar exercise with your cost equation. And then the idea becomes, how do I increase revenue? How do I reduce cost? You break those down into further metrics and then arrive at a level of granularity where you can start affecting things through product changes. All right. Now, let's do a quick check-in. So you figured out what outcomes you want to achieve over the next X months, whatever that period is. And then from those outcomes, you've derived a list of things or output you want to build. Now, what happens next? Obviously, what happens next is you start developing or you start, making some progress. And hopefully, if you type as fast as Jim Carrey in this GIF actually, which is not playing, then hopefully your sprint velocity is high and you can ship a bunch of stuff. So you're trying to make progress, but the $1 million question obviously here is, how do you know that you're making progress? How do you make sure that the stuff that you're shipping is actually in line with the outcomes that you wanted to achieve? And that's a super important question to answer, right? In a purely output driven roadmap, that's pretty easy. You can say I had 10 things that I wanted to ship. I've shipped 8 of those things. So my roadmap progress is 80%, assuming all things were equal. In an outcome driven world, that is far more complicated, right? So let's unpack that a bit. Let's figure out how, if there's any strategy, any tactics we can use to help address that problem, which brings us to something called the experiment loop, which was popularized by the lean startup movement. So the idea here is that everything that you do on the delivery side of things, you do it as a set of experiments. So you build something with the intention of measuring its impact, and you then learn from those measurements, and then you build again. So essentially, everything that you do is a goal, designing an experiment, shipping it, learning, iterating until you figure out the best solution. You achieve the outcome, or you basically give up and say, listen, I've tried 10 different things to affect this outcome, to achieve this outcome, and none of those things are working. Just going to simply give up, right? So essentially, you start thinking of your dev sprints as a series or set of hypotheses and experiments that you're validating to achieve an outcome. And when that outcome gets achieved is or doesn't get achieved, informs what you do in the future. Do you keep iterating? Do you move on to the next thing within the same outcome, or do you say, fine, this thing is now delivered, the outcome is achieved, I'm going to start working on some other outcome or some other output linked to that outcome, right? Now the question is, what does this approach mean for your roadmap? um, and it's pretty simple, right? So all it means is the stuff that you listed down that you would do to achieve each outcome, you need to think of those things as experiments. And I think that's an important perspective change, because as soon as you do that, you de-link yourself emotionally from the stuff that you're shipping or building, right? And that's a problem that far too many PMs face, which is they get too emotionally attached with stuff that they've built, and it hinders their ability to think about them objectively. And if the time comes to ever kill those things, it makes it super hard. So if everything that you're doing on a roadmap or in a sprint becomes just an experiment, so you're not even saying this is the right answer. All you're saying is that I think this might work. I think this might achieve the outcome that I'm trying to achieve. I think that perspective change is quite important. And it might sound trivial by just saying we haven't really done anything, we just think of this as experiments, but I think it's quite powerful when you actually employ this, and as a product organization, you build a culture where people start thinking about stuff that they're doing as experiments and don't get too attached to any single idea. So a few examples just to hopefully bring home the point, um, and illustrate the usefulness of everything that I've spoken about. All three examples that I'm going to share are from CarSwitch, and they've happened recently. So one of the outcomes that we wanted to affect, or the change that we wanted to bring about, was we wanted to increase organic sessions per user, specifically on the buyer side. The idea that we had was to create an alerts feature where someone could go in on the app and they could create an alert for the kind of car that they were looking for and hit save. And as soon as we got a new car that matched their criteria, we would send them a notification and hopefully re-engage and bring them back to the app. So this was the first iteration that's on your screen right now. This was the first iteration that we did for that specific feature. But the idea here is this one feature is just an experiment, right? So this is our first sort of take at what might work. But as we saw, we weren't satisfied with the numbers. We weren't satisfied with the impact that it created. So we ended up iterating on this. And instead of creating an independent sort of custom alert feature, we decided to bring it inside the search experience. So when you search for a car, we show you a prompt saying find your search, and we're showing you some listings. Do you also want to save the search and create an alert for it? So that was the second iteration. And then finally, what we ended up doing was we kept the same sort of concept, which is it has to be embedded within the customer's search journey. But we ended up tweaking the UI a bit, and it ended up giving us the boost that we were looking for. And at that point, we could, reasonably say that we'd achieved the outcome and that we were looking for. So that's just one example. And the second one that I'm going to share is around increasing our car publishing ratio. So, like I've described briefly, the way CarSwitch works is a seller comes to our platform and says, I want to sell their car, and we take care of the entire process. That's how we earn our commission. And by taking care of the process, I mean we also photograph and inspect the car before putting it up on our platform, and that creates a certain amount of friction in the car publishing journey. So you have the request, and then you need to schedule it, send a mechanic to the location, inspect, photograph the car, and then publish it, right? And there's a lot of drop-offs that happen during this process. So we were thinking, how can we improve this? And that's the outcome that we want to achieve. So one of the ideas that we came up with was this inspection report. There is obviously a need to send someone physically to the seller's location who can photograph and inspect the car, but can we remove that part? And I think the reason I'm sharing this example is I think because I think it drives home a point that uh, no feature is more important than the business, right? So the reason I say that is because a lot of the I would say the core tenet of CarSwitch's buyer experience is this inspection report, and that's the value prop that we've always stood by. Like cars on CarSwitch are pre-inspected, so every car goes through a thorough inspection, gets photographed, every little detail is noted, and it's displayed on the inspection report. But it was important for us to let go of that preconceived notion that this is something that users actually care about, and do an experiment where we actually hit the inspection report behind a button, so not displayed by default, and actually see how many people view the report before submitting a request, and then tracking them across the funnel and seeing how well they perform after they've submitted a request. Do they actually go and end up seeing the car? Do they test drive it? Do they negotiate? Do they close the deal or not? Now that I think so, something like this takes a lot of cuts because you need to let go of preconceived notions. You need to be daring enough to experiment with something that's such a core tenet of what you do and something that you've always believed in. But luckily at CarSwitch, we have the support and we have the right culture where we are not shy to run these experiments. And that's something, by the way, that's currently being run. So if you go on our website, you'd see this button, not see the inspection report by default, but on the app, we didn't decide to do it. So on the app, you can still see it. But it's just that this is, this is one way of experimenting with things. And hopefully the learnings that we get out of this would help inform if we can do something to minimize the friction in the card publishing journey such that we can improve the ratio that we're trying to achieve. The last one I have is one that's a bit counterintuitive, again, on the same outcome, increasing the car publishing ratio. The reason I wanted to share that was because the learnings were a bit odd. So we asked the seller to submit a request. We obviously asked for their phone number. Earlier, we would not authenticate the phone number, but we decided to run an experiment where we started sending them an OTP and authenticating their phone number. The idea, the hope was that when this request comes to us, now this person has validated their phone number, so we will for sure be able to reach them. So we won't have these drop-offs where we can't get in touch, so we can't schedule the inspection. And hopefully, that will improve our conversion rates in the funnel. But the expectation was we'll take a hit on the conversions because we're adding a step that increases friction in the online flow, but we'll hopefully see an improvement in our offline conversion rate because now we're getting a more serious set of users. We filtered out junk, dummy numbers, and people who were generally just not serious about selling the car. The experiment showed us that that was actually not true. We did take a hit on the online flow because of adding this step, but we found that our publishing rate or our conversion rate after someone submitted a request did not actually go up. And the conclusion that we drew from that was um, people who did not want to be contacted wasn't because they were submitting dummy or fake numbers. It was just that maybe we were contacting them at inappropriate times, so reaching them in the day when they were available in the evening or something like that, not because they were submitting bogus numbers. So again, useful learning coming out of an experiment that was done in earnest, trying to solve an outcome that we were trying to that we felt was important to achieve. Um, Lastly, some tactics that might help in this entire exercise, especially if you're part of a product team or an environment where you are not that outcome driven. When you start conversations in your roadmap discussions, let's just make sure that you don't jump right into solutions. So get clarity on business outcomes first and try to go from there. I would say most executives that I've known generally do want to hear ideas about how you would go around achieving certain outcomes. So come prepared with a list of output that you would deliver in order to achieve those outcomes, but don't necessarily start at that level. You could also do a retrospective analysis of stuff that you've shipped in the past which hasn't worked to drive home the point that not everything that we do is going to work. So why are we focused, or why do we consider output so important when most of the things that we do don't work? And that's generally true across the board for product organizations all across the world, right? So let's focus on outcomes and let's try to achieve those. Um, on the execution bit, so at CarSwitch, for example, every spec document that we write, we include what success means. At the top of the document, we say what success means and how we'll measure it. So nothing gets into delivery or nothing gets into execution until we've decided what is success for us and how we're going to measure it. So we put in the right instrumentation, tracking the right things, and only then it goes into development. Also, as part of our SOP, whenever we launch something, we said calendar invite for a post-launch analysis. So everything that goes live needs to be measured, and the analysis has to be done. The learnings have to be synthesized and shared with the team so that we can decide on next steps. On managing, if you're a product leader, if you have product managers working with you, you do foster a culture where strong opinions are loosely held by people, and they're not afraid to experiment and change their opinions or their perceptions based on data or learnings that they gather from experiments. You need to reward outcomes instead of pure output. And one of the things we've recently started doing at CarSwitch is we've started these quarterly impact assessment check-ins with PMs where we literally pretend like we're in an interview setting, and I'm the interviewer and the PM is the interviewee, and I have no idea about CarSwitch, and they need to speak to me about last 3 months of their career and try to convince me or try to impress me during an interview setting. um, and what that does is that forces them to speak about things or think about things which have delivered impact. So they can't tell me, listen, I fixed 10 bugs, because as an interviewer who doesn't know anything about CarSwitch, I'm not going to be impressed. So the idea is to shift the focus a bit from output to outcomes, and for them to seriously consider what have they done in the last 3 months, that they can reasonably talk about in an interview setting. And hopefully that builds a culture where they're prioritizing outcome whenever they think about the roadmaps, sprints, and bring that into the decision making. And that's pretty much. I'm just going to recap in a minute. So we started with roadmaps. How do you define them? What are the good and bad ways? We discussed that we should focus on outcomes, which are changes in human behavior that can drive business results. Then we've discussed how how do you come up with those outcomes. You could use customer journey maps or revenue or cost equations to decide which outcomes you want to pursue, and then you could use this experiment loop or this hypothesis build learn loop to actually deliver on those outcomes and figure out whether you've achieved them or not. And then finally, I think it's important to foster a culture that promotes data backed experimentation and rewards outcomes instead of pure output or busy work. And that is pretty much it. um, I believe we still have some time for questions. So if you guys have anything, feel free to ask.
Yeah, awesome. Ali, on behalf of the Product Soch team and product community, thank you so much for delivering such an insightful session. So, actually, the point you made about big benefit of being outcome driven is that the team feels empowered and not being told what to build, instead being asked to solve a problem. That actually really resonated with me. I mean, I found that approach completely changes the game in terms of the creativity that your team is able to bring to the table to solve the challenge at hand. So great insights throughout the sessions. Yeah, we've got a couple of questions coming in, so we'll jump into that. Um, I'm wondering if anybody would like to join the stage. They can ask the questions to Ali directly, or I can read some of those out. So uh, yeah, we'll just give it a couple of seconds, and then actually I'll start reading questions. If you want to join, there's a link in the chat where you can ask live questions. So Ali, one of the questions was, and they framed it as an absurd question, but they say, when one is prototyping, how is the management how's the management looking into the feature building? Because prototyping is all about validating hypothesis, right? What if it fails? How do you communicate that failure? And then how do you come out of it? Because at the end of the day, revenue is all that matters to management.
So let me make sure I understood that correctly. So you're saying
Sure.
I didn't get the part where prototyping is linked to the thing failing, or are these two separate questions?
Well, so it's basically two parts of the same question. I guess what they're trying to ask is essentially prototyping slash experimentation, right?
All right.
It's that is all about validating a hypothesis. So what if it fails? How do you communicate that failure? That hey, we tried this, this didn't work out, and how do they take that? Because at the end of the
Yeah.
day, yeah, and Rahman posted this question is at the end of the day,
Yeah.
revenue is what matters to management. So
Right.
what has your experience been
But
like with that?
so great question, Raman, and I think that's something that almost every product person struggles with, right? So failure is part of the job. I think what's important, and I personally suggest doing, is setting the right expectations. So when you go into building anything, if the expectation that you set is this is going to change the world, then you're likely to fail every time. So you start setting yourself up for failure, basically, because most stuff that you do will not work. So it's important that you create that right expectations with your stakeholders, with your management, and bring them along the journey, right? So don't work in a silo. Once you've figured out what outcomes you want to work on, uh, bring them along on the journey, saying, listen, I know this is what we're prioritizing, this is what I'm planning to do. There's a risk that this might not work, and this is why it might not work, right? So you have different types of risks. Maybe the user will not find enough value, and it's important that you also tell them how you're mitigating those risks. So if there's a value risk, you could tell them, listen, we've run focus groups, we've run surveys, we feel that people will use this feature, right? But obviously there's nothing like actually putting stuff into the user's hands and seeing if they use it or not. So you can't ever know 100% whether something will work or not. So set the right expectations, make sure that you give them confidence that you've thought about the risks and done something to mitigate those risks. And then if something fails, it does fail you and you can't do anything about that.
Okay, awesome. Um, Another question we have is how to foster data-driven decision making in a setup where decisions are mostly backed by executives. Um, I've seen this as well, right? It's the frustration that we have as product managers. Hey, we we try to be data-driven, but often that data gets ignored because there's somebody higher up who kind of has their own idea, perhaps, and maybe their own data set. So how do you navigate and tackle that?
It's also a tough one, right? And that's the this tough part about being a PM. Um, I guess you could look at past decisions that were made and use data to say whether those worked or not, and that might help
Hmm.
put some light on maybe bad decision making, decisions that were made on whims of executives, and say we've done a bunch of stuff in the past, and this is what the data tells us worked or did not work, and then basically building agreement or alignment around. So I think it's also important how you present that data, right? So it has to be contextualized. The way you present it is also very important. So you can't randomly blurt numbers out and hope that it'll make sense, because maybe management does not have the appreciation for numbers the same way you do. Maybe they don't understand them. So it's important
Right.
to present or unpack stuff and bring it to a level where they can understand and appreciate it, and also do some retrospectives and say, listen, we've done certain things in the past and they've not worked out, and this is what the data tells us. So uh, and we try to build that understanding. And this process takes time, right? This is not going to happen overnight, and you're going to need certain people who back you in those conversations, in those meetings. So try to find those allies, people that you can rely on, and help build consensus with other stakeholders and people that matter.
Yeah, I love that. Use past numbers to fight for your current numbers, right? So that's great. We've got some people who are live as well, or want to ask a live question. I'm just going to bring them in. So I'll start with Rahman. I'm going to bring you into the chat. Rahman, are you there? Can you hear me? Okay.
Hey
Wait for
guys,
him to speak.
Assalamu alaikum.
Yeah, awesome.
First of all,
Walaikum salam.
great session. Can you hear me, guys?
Yes.
Yes, we can hear you.
Am I audible?
Yep.
Am I audible?
Yep.
Oh, okay, great. So I just like to post another question on YouTube about if the product is all about delivery, means your product is kind of a white label solution, and you're going to this clients and you're selling your white label solution. So now the white label solution has a kind of a downside of it, because you are backed with certain time box deliveries. So how do you apply the project management principles there? Obviously, there will be certain areas where there will be certain customization required, but that is like around 20 to 25%, but it's time box. So in time box deliveries, how do you apply product management principles? Like, and do you have a chance of doing some prototyping there, coming up with new innovative ideas? Like, how do you go about it? See, in SaaS world, it's different, B2C. You have, you gave a great example on CarSwitch. It makes sense there, and I'm sure, your management, top management or top tier leadership would be in complete consensus with you. But what if, it's all about delivery here? You have a white label solution, and there are customizations. How do you go about it? I hope, I'm able to convey my question to you.
Yeah, great question, Rahman, I believe. So, listen, disclaimer, I don't have the same depth of experience that I have in B2C. So this is, if I understood correctly, this is a B2B question where you developing a SaaS application, which is a white label solution, and you focused on delivery because you want to meet certain milestones that have been set
Correct.
in stone.
Correct.
Right. Okay.
Yes. Yeah. You
So
got the. Yes. I do.
yes. So and how do you apply product management principles in that, right? So obviously, and is this your own sort of product, your own white label
Like my
solution, or
my
you work for a services company who's meant to deliver
my
this?
past experience, my past experience was in the company where we had a solution, and we're working with financial institutes, and we're delivering our products to them, and there were a lot of customization, but the top tier just used to think, oh, this is just a 20 odd person, where the customization would require, because
Yeah.
the workflows will remain standardized, and you just need to change here and there a few things. But like we were not focusing on product management. It was more on the
Right.
delivery side of things. It
Yeah.
was more focused on execution than like
Yeah.
on the, because yeah, I have this idea a product manager has to wear two hats. One is like
Yeah.
being on the innovation side, where he come up with new ideas and validate them, and the second like part is all about execution, because without execution
Right.
and nothing is, and you won't be
Yeah.
having any value out of it. Yeah, please.
So I guess I would, if I were in your shoes, I would try having conversations with people who are giving these requirements around what is it that they're trying to do. So, like I said in my session as well, I think it helps to elevate the conversations from output to outcome. So, yes, you want us to customize this thing, you want us to build this feature, but what is it that you're actually trying to achieve? And it's like peeling an onion, right? So you keep asking these questions until you get to the job to be done, essentially. So I'm sure when they suggest something or suggest a customization, they probably have a fairly good idea about what is it that they're trying to achieve. So maybe it's coming from customers, maybe it's a business need, whatever it is, right? So you need to, if you can understand what is that need, then maybe you can propose certain things which might work better, right? And that's where, that discovery work that you mentioned comes in, that the different hat that PMs need to wear, where you're essentially, boiling things down or, digging down to the job to be done level and figuring out from that what can I build, what can I ship that can materially affect this outcome, or that this job to be done can be done in a better way. So I don't know how your communication looks like, whether you're even involved in those discussions, but if you could, that's how I would try to approach it. Talk to these guys about what is it that they're trying to solve, essentially, and then go from there. That makes sense.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Great question. I'm going to bring in Rohil, and this will be actually our last question for the day. Rohil, are you there? We're having some trouble hearing him. I did see his question. I think here's something. Rohil?
Yes, I'm here. Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay. So I have a question. In one of the templates, it was written that, one of the outcomes was increase screen time by 10%. Now, my first thought over here, isn't that 10% kind of subjective? I mean, it could be 10% because maybe I like using the app and I using it more, but it could also be 10% because I question.
Royal, sorry, I lost the last part of the question. And maybe it's written down, so at least read it.
I can, yeah. So I guess what Rohil is trying to ask is, so one of the outcomes stated, he said, is increase time by 10%. And it's good we're quantifying it, but how do we actually know that this 10% actually creates customer value?
Yeah,
Right.
it also could be because 10% because I'm having a hard time using the app or web service.
Yeah. Okay.
Fair question. The metric that I put on the slide was hypothetical, so I made it up, and it doesn't mean anything. But you're absolutely right that just coming up with random numbers is not helpful because they could mean different things. So I think for this, I would go back to our customer journey map or our revenue equation, right? So and start deriving your metrics from those instead of coming up with them randomly. So, like you said, spending more time in the app, are they struggling, that's why they're spending more time, or are they actually getting more engagement done, or more they're enjoying the app a bit more. So again, the number was made up. It probably doesn't make sense, but I would encourage you to go use maybe the CGM or the revenue equation to figure out which metrics you want to improve.
Okay. Awesome. Thank you so much, Ali, and thank you everyone for who posted the questions and joined. So that concludes our session. But before we leave, I'd just like to take this opportunity to make a couple of quick announcements. Our next session will be about finding product market fit. That's featuring Shiv Shi, who is a product manager at LinkedIn Learning. That's happening on November 17th. So do keep your eyes open for that notification and register so you don't miss out on a great speaker and a great topic. Product Soch is also organizing our flagship in-person event called Epic Zero. So stay tuned for an announcement regarding date, time, venue, and ticketing information. And finally, we've also been working around the clock to bring you more great product management content, and recently launched our new podcast called Sochcast. So if you haven't checked that out already, search for Product Soch on YouTube to get in on the action. Ali, thank you so much once again. This was amazing. And yeah, with that, we'll conclude today's session. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining, and have a great day.
Thank you, guys. Really appreciate it.